it's lucid. I'm so high, up and lucid. You take me to a safe place. We steady on the same pace, yeah. I'm crazy, you like that. Don't back down, no you talk back. Keep it spicy, that's a fact. We on the right track, yeah. Driving me wild, giddy up like a stallion. Saddle up and ride you, we crossing the line like a champion. Driving me wild, giddy up like a stallion. Saddle up and ride you, we crossing the line, we some champions. We know how to make it rain in the bedroom. We don't need a club, got our own groove. Coming at the same time, yeah.
Hey guys, welcome to LA Love Creative, and today we're talking about my first impressions of the Sony FX3, why I think I'm in love with this camera, and as a Canon shooter, would I make this switch? Now, in the past, I was a Canon shooter. I shot Canon for a lot of my career, and then I moved on to Sony and shot Sony for about 2 years. I had the Sony A7 III, I also had the A7 III. I then, however, switched back to Canon. I got the Canon C70, which is right here, and I'm a big fan of that ecosystem. I needed to use the FX3. It's been on my list for a long time, and I'm so glad I actually got a chance to shoot with this. So I shot a model. We were doing kind of lingerie, swimwear, fashion. We're doing like a normal shoot that I normally do. And I thought this would be a perfect camera, not only for the video portion of the shoot, but also for the photography portion of the shoot, because even though this camera is a videography camera first and a photography camera second, it has a 12 megapixel sensor. So it's not the best photography camera. The Sony FX3 compared to the Sony A7S III, the Sony A7S III has a viewfinder. The Sony FX3 is more catered to filmmakers, so it has a hot shoe with the audio unit connected to it. I personally don't use viewfinders that much when I'm shooting photography. The monitors on the back of these cameras nowadays are so good that I usually shoot like just looking at the back of the screen. I know it's probably not the best, but that's how I shoot. Now, I shot this model named Anastasia. We were shooting lingerie, fashion, shooting a lot of just swimwear, stuff like that. And she had a lot of great energy and a lot of great movement. So this was a great shoot to incorporate the FX3, the way it could handle motion, the way they could handle stills, and I just had a blast shooting this model. Now, one thing I love about the FX3 is the size. The size I thought was gonna bother me because it's a small camera compared to my Canon C70, which is a small camera too, but I felt like this camera was gonna be too small in my hands. I felt like it was gonna be too light and shaky when I was shooting with it. I love the size of this camera. I think it's a perfect camera for interviews, a B camera setup where you can have your main camera. It could also be the main camera because the image coming out of this camera is amazing. It's just a great camera that you could put on a gimbal and not really compromise on quality, which I really like. One thing I like about the functionality is even though it's a very light camera, it actually is built really well. I love the button layout. I love the way that the screen swivels out. I think that's awesome. I used to make fun of Sony cameras because they're menu systems, and I'm gonna be real, it's not the best menu system out there, but I think we're getting to a point where I don't think we can blame Sony for the menu system now, because they are really making strides on how to make this menu better. This menu system is probably one of the cleanest that Sony has ever came out with. I really love the fact it was touchscreen. Everything I felt was in a better place as far as settings than other Sony cameras have been. Like, I've had to dig into menus in other cameras. In this camera, I felt like I kind of had a better idea of where things were. The image quality coming out of the FX3 when it comes to video, let's start with video. I think the camera is amazing. I personally would only shoot Cinetone on this camera. I know you can get more dynamic range shooting S-Log, S-Log2, S-Log3 or whatever, but I think the Cinetone on this camera is one of the major selling points. When I was shooting Cinetone on this camera, I felt like I didn't even have to grade the image. The images were just coming out amazing. The colors, yes, you probably lose a little dynamic range shooting Cinetone, but I think the pros outweigh the cons, and I'd rather just really awesome color and great skin tones without having to grade too much. I love it. I think Cinetone, if you really want this camera, you're gonna want to shoot in Cinetone for 90% of your projects. Sony cameras tend to be sharper than Canon, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I personally like a camera that's not too sharp, but when I was shooting with this camera, I felt like the footage was so crispy and just so high quality that even the sharpness didn't bother me. One of the things I like about this image is, even though the dynamic range is probably not as good as my C70 or other cameras I've used, I didn't really find that to be a problem. Now, it's not the best when it comes to dynamic range, but I think the image is a good balance between highlights and shadows, and I was a big fan of this image. When it comes to photography, I wasn't expecting much. It's a 12 megapixel camera. Obviously, I have the Canon R6, 20 megapixels. I have my Canon R, which is I think 30 something megapixels. I got a Canon RP. I have other cameras that have a better pixel count. However, 12 megapixels to me is nothing to complain about. The image looks great. I was shooting a model in low light and high dynamic range situations, and the camera held up pretty well. Yeah, it's not a photography camera, but I think it's a great camera to have if you want to pull a couple stills from your shoots, maybe a couple behind the scenes photos. And even as a photography camera, I couldn't say anything bad about it. The images look great. Comparing the images to my Canon R6, obviously I'm a Canon fanboy, so I think the photography images are gonna come out of the Canon a little bit better. I think the colors look better on the Canon, but the Sony looks really good too. So it's not really a matter of one image looks bad and the other image looks, better. It's a matter of preference. Which image resonates better with you, and what image do you enjoy shooting the most? One of the major selling points I think this camera has over my C70 is the autofocus on this camera is just so good. It's got eye detect autofocus. It's got face detect autofocus. You can shoot this camera in low light situations and it's finding the eye. You can shoot the camera in with a lens flare behind the model and it's finding the focus. Now, a couple situations, obviously it missed a little bit, but I'm talking about like a 90% success rate. So I think a camera like this would be great for fashion. Anything that's fast moving, that you want to really make sure that you get the autofocus working on that. I'm shooting on the FX3 right now, and one of the coolest things I like about this camera is the top handle has audio inputs, XLR audio inputs. Yes, the C70 has XLR inputs, but it has a mini XLR input, which doesn't bother me. But the cool thing that this little camera has a top handle that can take full XLR inputs, awesome. Now the Canon C70 versus the FX3, I think they both are amazing cameras. I love the Canon C70. I like the dynamic range that this camera has. I like the fact that it has built-in ND filters. I'd say one of the biggest things that the FX3 doesn't have that the Canon does, and it's hard to go back from that. Also love Canon colors, but as far as the FX3, when it comes to budget, the FX3 is $4,000. The Canon C70 is around $6,000, maybe $5,500, but $6,000. So I think as far as price, if you have the budget, you can go either way. I think you'll be happy with either results. I personally would continue to keep my C70. I really love that camera. However, I might in the future end up buying a few FX3s just because I found that this camera was so fun to use. And I think it'd be great to have two of them on a wedding shoot or a fashion shoot. So time will tell if I actually decide to buy a FX3, but so far I love this camera and I think it's a total game changer. So that's all I have to say about the Sony FX3. I had a blast shooting with this camera. Let me know if you have any questions about Canon or Sony, and I will see you next time. See you later.